So I was asked to talk about U.S.-Russian relations, and at the time I was asked, there was this interesting question. Why is Mr. Trump so friendly towards Russia? It sounded like a bromance between Putin and Russia, Putin and Trump. So that's the title, but I had the sneaky suspicion that that wasn't going to last. So that's where the title of the talk came from. And so this is the way I'm going to approach it. The first section is what I call Sasha's perspective. So the Sasha in question is my old friend Alexander Bakayev, who is a former, he was a Russian expert on national security affairs. He was very helpful to me when I was researching said PhD thesis. He sadly passed away a few years ago. But Sasha could always be counted upon to give the kind of semi-official Russian view of what's going on in the world. In memory of my friend Sasha, I'm naming this part of the talk after him. This is kind of the way a Russian expert would tell the story, because I think it's really important to understand that, to understand the whole rest of the story. I guess I should mention that Sasha was almost certainly connected in one way or another with the KGB. You can factor that in. All right, so after I give you Sasha's perspective, I will give you a few more perspectives on kind of just what the situation is at the moment. That's the current scene thing. I'll then talk a little bit about what American options are for policy towards Russia, and then say a little bit about kind of where I think things are going. Flash warning, I think the bromance is dead. So before I jump into that, let me start with a little historical vignette. So the story is, here we are, August 1944, right? So it's the last year of World War II. Eisenhower has landed in beaches of Normandy in France. The Soviet army is approaching the gates of Warsaw. So at this moment, the Polish home army, the Polish partisans, rise up in Moscow and try to drive the Nazi army out of Warsaw, link up with the Russian army, and try to establish for themselves a kind of an independent identity separate from this Russian army that's sweeping through their country. What happened was the Germans rushed in reinforcements into the area, pushed the Soviets back, crushed the rebels. The Soviets, Stalin kind of at first promised to help the Americans and the British to help the Poles, but then went back on that promise. And so the U.S. ambassador to Russia, Ambassador Harriman, before these events believed that the U.S. could work with the Russians after the war, as his then boss, President Franklin Roosevelt, also believed. But after this happened, they were so shocked at the brutality of the Soviet attitude, basically not caring that people who are their allies are getting slaughtered, that it seriously shook the American officialdom's belief that there was any way we could possibly work with these people. So what we're seeing now is, in a way, a repeat of exactly that experience from the end of World War II. We thought we could get along with them, but they seem to be so ruthless, especially in the way they treat bordering countries, that it's an outrage to American opinion. But the U.S. also can't stop them from doing it. So that's the dilemma. The U.S. can neither stop them from doing it, nor accept the fact that they're going to do it, whether we like it or not. So, meanwhile, here's Sasha's take. Sasha would begin that Russia has a history of vulnerability. Russia has been repeatedly invaded by its neighbors. First there is Tartars, led by Genghis Khan. Then Ivan Grozny, you call him Ivan Terrible. He conquered Tartars, But Tartars did not stop slave raids against Russia for centuries. Then was time of troubles, maybe worse time for Russia. Polish army in Moscow. This is after the death of Ivan Grozny. 1 century later, Charles XII, even Sweden, invades Russia. The next century, Napoleon invades Russia. The next century, Germany invades Russia twice. So I'll drop the accent now. But, so the lesson from the Russian perspective is that Russia is never safe from invasion. Right? My friend Eugene Goltz likes to write when he's thinking about how to think about American foreign policy, that the United States is lucky because it's relatively immune strategically from attack. To our north and our south, we have weak and friendly countries. To our east and our west, we have fish. Right? Russia doesn't get that. Right? So number one thing to understand is that the Russians, for good reason, are worried about their security in a way, at a level far beyond what the United States really needs to worry about. So there's a map of the Tartar yoke. The story being that basically all of Russia, except for the frozen north, was under the control of the Mongols. At the same time, the Mongols also controlled China, Iran, and so on. Okay, so point one for Sasha is Russia is historically and always potentially threatened. Point number two is, nevertheless, Russia is also historically a great power. And Russia takes pride in that and makes it a priority to be so. So the flip side of all those points of weakness were these times of strength. As early as Peter the Great, in the early 1700s, you had Russian armies in Copenhagen. Half a century later, Tsaritsa Elizabeth briefly occupied Berlin in the 7 Years' War. General Suvorov, campaigning against the French Revolution, got as far as Switzerland. A few years later, Tsar Alexander was in Paris after having defeated Napoleon. Any Russian you meet on the street will tell you in the first 5 minutes of conversation, correctly, that the Soviet Union destroyed the majority of the German army during World War II. That roughly 3/4. And everything everybody else did against the Nazis just took care of the other quarter. And the result of that, of course, is that, again, the Russian army ends up in Moscow. So the Russian view is that no major world issue can be resolved without Russian involvement. You need to ask us before you do anything, guys, or we Russians won't be happy and things won't work out very well for anybody. So from that perspective, back to that little vignette I gave you before, the Russian perspective on how the Cold War happened is, unsurprisingly, it's the fault of us Americans. The story is that Roosevelt and Stalin genuinely were working for some way of working together, cooperatively to maintain peace after World War II was over. And Stalin generally wanted peace, and he thought that there was a good chance of reaching some kind of a bargain with the Americans. But from the Soviet perspective, the Americans set a double standard. When the United States Army marches into some place and takes over, like in Italy or Japan, the United States sets up anti-communist governments. And the Russians don't complain about it. But when the Russians march into some place, like in Eastern Europe, in Poland or Romania or whatever, and set up a communist government, the U.S. does complain about it, right? So, what's up with that? That's the double standard. Why is it the Russians can't ensure that countries near their borders are friendly to them, just like the Americans ensure that countries that their armies occupy are friendly to us? Not only that, the U.S. keeps military bases all the way across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, so Russia is encircled by American military bases. From the Soviet perspective, it's the Americans who start the Cold War, the Americans and the Brits, right? The first declaration of the Cold War was arguably Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech of 1946, when then U.S. President Truman was sitting right there on the podium behind Churchill while he was saying this stuff. From the Russian perspective, the Marshall Plan, it wasn't just a plan for lots of American economic aid to rebuild Europe after World War II. The quid pro quo, the requirement was that anybody who receives that aid has to agree to a lot of coordination and integration of their economy with the rest of Europe and with the United States, right? So from the Soviet perspective, that means you're trying to control our economy. That's what this is really about. So they saw that as a threat to them, which in some sense it actually was. Then, of course, NATO is a military alliance. It was aimed against Russia, and we'll come back to this point. But the Russians ask, well, why is it still there? Cold War's over, right? So this is a map of kind of the current American military presence, because I couldn't find a map of a similar one in 1945. But it gives you the general picture. If you look north over the North Pole from Russia, you see Canada and the United States. If you look west and southwest from Russia, you see NATO Europe, all the way around to Turkey. If you look east and southeast from Russia, you see Alaska and Japan. So in fact, from their perspective, they really are surrounded. And they worry about it. They worry about it a lot. The next point my friend Sasha would make is that, if you think about how the Cold War ended essentially because Soviet President Gorbachev decided to end the Cold War by being nice, in spite of Reagan's very hard line against the Soviet Union until almost the very end. And what Soviet Union and Russia got for their niceness was they got taken to the cleaners. So Gorbachev makes one concession after another. 1987, he agrees to the INF Treaty, which abolishes a class of nuclear-armed missiles, but in a way that really restrains the Russians more than the West. The next year, the Soviet Union, Gorbachev announced unilateral troop cuts in Central Europe. So Soviet troops are going to pull out of Central Europe, taking away a long-standing threat that American generals had nightmares about how many troops the Russians had in East Germany could just kind of march into West Germany on a moment's notice. It looked pretty scary. Gorbachev decides, okay, fine, we'll take them away. 1989, Soviet Union starts withdrawing from Afghanistan, and look what happened there. 1990, Soviet Union agrees to the unification of Germany within NATO, strengthening one of their most potent allies. One of the most potent potential adversaries. In 1991, Russia allows the peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Union, which Putin thinks of as the greatest geopolitical tragedy in world history, which is a wonderful illustration of how somebody who's very historically minded can have absolutely no historical context whatsoever in some of their attitudes. Right? I mean, obviously there are worse geopolitical tragedies in world history than that, but from the Soviet point of view, or from the Russian point of view, it's among the worst for them. Because look, World War II, they lost 20 million people, but hey, they ended up on top. Right? With the Cold War, they didn't lose anybody, but they did lose a lot of power. So the point is, Gorbachev was trying to build a genuine equal partnership with the West. The problem is that they weren't equal. The Soviet Union was a lot weaker. And so, President Bush in particular, the first Bush, very genteelly discussed all of these issues with Gorbachev and took everything Gorbachev offered and offered nothing back and got away with it. So, from the Russian point of view, why are we being nice? Then, after the Cold War, the Americans get worse, not better. They get more aggressive. NATO expands to the Russian border. So, here's a picture of that, right? So the various shades of blue are sort of Cold War NATO. And then the other colors are the later additions to NATO, all of which are former Soviet allies, except for the ones that were formerly part of the Soviet Union itself. So again, why is there not only still this anti-Russian military alliance, but why is it growing and getting closer and closer to Russia if you Americans want to be our friends? And that's just the start. In 1995, NATO bombs Russia's friends, the Serbs, in the Bosnia War. In 1999, bombs Serbia in the Kosovo War. 2002, President George W. Bush withdraws from the ABM Treaty, that is to say, what was seen as the bedrock of arms control for the previous 30 years. President Bush suddenly announces, sorry, we're not going to be bound by that anymore. We're going to just go ahead and build missile defense anyway. 2003, the American invasion of Iraq, which from the Russian perspective, and probably from any strict international legal perspective, was unprovoked aggression. Slight reminder, Saddam Hussein had nothing whatsoever to do with 9/11, right? Bad guy, but he didn't do that. And then in 2011, during the reset, so-called, between Obama and then Russian President Medvedev, Medvedev votes in the UN in favor of a no-fly zone to prevent a humanitarian disaster in Libya. And what the US does is starts with a no-fly zone and then turns that into regime change, overthrowing Gaddafi. Right? So again, the Russians were being cooperative, and what do they feel they got out of it? They got taken advantage of. And Gaddafi's dead. And then, the worst blow of all, from the perspective especially of Putin, which is essentially the Americans are trying to take over the immediate environment of Russia and maybe even trying to subvert the Russian government itself. So the background, George Soros' Open Society Foundation spent over $1.5 billion over the course of a decade or two promoting democracy in the former Soviet bloc, promoting civil society organizations, which later are involved in all of these color revolutions, all of which are revolutions in the former Soviet space, that is to say, former pieces of the Soviet Union itself, revolutions against pro-Russian governments, replacing them with pro-Western governments. If you're an ex-KGB officer, that really looks like a conspiracy. So, first one was the so-called Rose Revolution in Georgia. Pushed out the former Soviet foreign minister, Edward Shevardnadze, as president of Georgia, replaced him with an anti-Russian leader named Mikhail Saakashvili. In the next year, it's the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, where the pro-Russian President Yanukovych wins a disputed election, but then protests force him out before he can take office. Next year, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan, again, a pro-Russian president pushed out. 2014, the ill-fated Yanukovych gets kicked out again. And so for Putin, this is the last straw. Ukraine is by far the most geostrategically important neighbor that Russia has. It is not okay for Ukraine to be anything other than pro-Russia, and Russia will do whatever it takes to make sure that Ukraine is not going to be anti-Russian. That's the reason for everything that follows. This is Putin's own words. And basically, what this does, this is a summary of everything I just said, right? Sasha's take is precisely Putin's take. And by the way, I put these together separately, right? I knew what Sasha would have said. I summarized it. Then I found this. Wow, it matches up perfectly. Putin said in this famous speech, which American officials interpreted as proving, the nastiness of Russia. Putin said, the U.S. is trying to create a unipolar world, a world in which there is one master, one sovereign. But he commented, this allows no moral foundations for modern civilization. Right? He argued, and again, this is in the aftermath of the invasion of Iraq, the U.S. is guilty of an almost uncontained hyper-use of military force, greater and greater disdain for the basic principles of international law. So it's important to understand this. Putin is trying to argue as a liberal, saying that it's the Americans who are being profoundly illiberal. The Americans are the ones who are trying to take over everything, dominate everything, use military force indiscriminately. And the result is the fact that no one feels safe, Putin says. And by no one, he means nobody in Russia. Then he adds, plans to extend certain elements of the anti-missile defense system to Europe cannot help but disturb us. Who needs the next step? An inevitable arms race. He wasn't blowing smoke. We've got that arms race. It started. I think it's obvious that NATO expansion represents a serious provocation. Against whom is this expansion intended? Then again, liberal argument. We are unequivocally in favor of strengthening the regime of nonproliferation. And again, he's not just blowing smoke here. Russia was helpful in achieving the nuclear restraint agreement with Iran. If Russia hadn't helped, it wouldn't have happened. So Putin's point is that Russia wants to cooperate with the West. It's the West that's acting aggressively from his perspective. But on the other hand, Russia has something called a document called the foreign policy concept of the Russian Federation. One line in there says that a key Russian goal is to consolidate the Russian Federation's position as a center of influence in today's world. All right? Power and status themselves are Russian goals. So on the one hand, they like to think of themselves as being liberal and wanting cooperation. On the other hand, power and status are goals of themselves. All right, so that's my friend Sasha's take. Now I'll give you the take of my friend Ariel Cohen from the Heritage Foundation. All right, so he would say, look, the Russians have been aggressive from day one. Since 1992, Russia has been supporting, even before Russia was independent, they've been supporting separatists in areas like Azerbaijan, Georgia, Moldova, and now Russia's maintaining those places as so-called frozen conflicts, preventing any resolution of these conflicts, because having those conflicts is a source of leverage for them, a source of influence with those countries, right? And that's, of course, exactly the same tactic they're using in Ukraine now, right? If the Ukrainian government doesn't want to make nice, we will, gnaw off chunks of your territory until you start paying attention to us. Then the Russians follow up again in 2008 with an invasion of Georgia, not only the separatist region of South Ossetia, but also continuing beyond it towards the Georgian capital, Tbilisi itself. Then in 2014, of course, there was the annexation of Crimea, followed by the instigation of the war in eastern Ukraine. Different estimates of the casualties in the last 3 years range from 10,000 to 50,000 people dead in that war. So this is serious. And then, of course, that's followed by the Russian intervention in Syria, taking a already vicious civil war and making it worse. In that context, the fact that, let me go back a few slides here. Come on, go back. Oh no, sorry, wrong button. All right, so if you look at Estonia and Latvia, the farthest northeastern parts of NATO, that's not just right on the Russian border. That's just within 100 miles or so of Leningrad, or St. Petersburg now, the second largest city in Russia. So that's right not only on the Russian border, but on the border of the Russian heartland. Those places are very, very vulnerable. And so in the context of what Putin is doing to Ukraine, worries about defending those places take a very prominent place in thinking about American national security. Then, of course, you can't be a good conservative without hating the enemy, and so you have to point out that Putin is evil, ruthless, tough, and destroyed American democracy, all of which is true. Right. So this is a quote. I'm pretty sure it is from Ariel Cohen. Obama has looked like a deer in the headlights when faced with a relentlessly aggressive foe. That's the way you got to think about it. It's the Russians who are evil, right? So, recap, right? Sasha's take. Russia's been trying to cooperate. It's the Americans who are aggressive. Ariel's take. Russians are evil and aggressive and want to take over the world. Now, throw into the mix a couple of other things about trying to understand what the Russians are up to. Just to confuse you further, if you know, one of the things I've learned in 30 years in the national security business, if you think you understand what's going on, you're missing something. So first of all, there's another set of motives that my friend Mike McFall, the former U.S. ambassador to Russia, has pointed out, which is the domestic political calculations behind Putin's foreign policy. The average salary in Russia dropped by almost half in 2014, largely due to dropping oil prices. So, you got to know that Putin's poll numbers were down. So what does he do? He annexes the Ukraine, and the public loves it, right? It's a classic rally around the flag effect. Poll numbers go up in an international crisis. That works so well in domestic politics from this interpretation that Putin decides to go ahead and invade eastern Ukraine as well. Now again, this is not the only reason Putin did this, certainly not. Certainly a lot of it was reactive. It was primarily about fear of losing influence in Ukraine. That's absolutely true. But there was this domestic politics piece of it. And the domestic politics piece makes more sense at explaining why did he then the next year also intervene in Syria, which is not a vital Russian interest, right? And there's only two explanations of that. One is the domestic politics argument, and the other is that it's a status play. Putin cares about Russia's status and its perceived power in the world, both as an end in itself and as for its domestic politics benefit. So that's point one. Then there's another joker in the deck, which is the way Putin runs things. He has this sort of tacit mafioso style of delegating authority, right? So, it's very much this kind of sense of, take care of this for me, okay? Right? And the point is precisely that he's not always entirely clear about how he wants something taken care of. So, for example, the way the war in Chechnya was settled was he found himself a Chechen thug by the name of Ramzan Kadyrov to be his strong man to keep Chechnya down. And it's worked okay. But Kadyrov has a lot of autonomy in exactly how he does that, and who's got to get whacked to make that happen. And so it's very possible, it's likely, I think, that Kadyrov was the guy who killed former Prime Minister Nemtsov, who had come out as an opponent of Putin, a critic of Putin. So he was murdered by assassins in a black limousine in Red Square, right outside the Kremlin. And they're pretty sure it was Kadyrov's men who did it. And it's entirely possible that Putin didn't explicitly order it, but rather that Kadyrov was simply trying to curry favor with Putin by showing how far he was willing to go to help Putin out against one of his enemies. And similarly, it's entirely possible, I don't know what I just did, it's entirely possible that Putin doesn't fully control those militias in eastern Ukraine. So even if he wants to stop the war in Ukraine, it's not entirely clear that he might, that he can easily control and stop that war if he wants to. Do I need to do anything about that? Let's see. All right. So, with all that as background, now, so what's the agenda? Yeah. Oh, there we go. Okay. Just, oops. Yeah, I always hit the wrong button. Okay, I can turn off the. Yeah. So US-Russian agenda today. So first of all, the Russian intervention in Syria is probably the most acute problem. Right? That's the place where President Trump launched the 59 cruise missiles recently. And it's an unbelievably complicated situation. From the Russian perspective, all they're doing is supporting the internationally recognized legal government of Syria under President Assad, helping him out against a bunch of militant terrorist groups like ISIS and the local al-Qaeda affiliate, the terrorist group formerly known as al-Nusra. That's their take. The American take is, yeah, the problem is they're also going after the moderate rebels too. And in fact, primarily against them. So that's issue number one. Issue number two, Russia is continuing to foment civil war in Ukraine. Fighting is still going on. It's not on the front pages anymore, but people are still dying there every week. So Russia wants, on the one hand, to control Ukraine, to get away with everything they've done, and not to pay any price for it, right? So they want the American sanctions lifted. Then there's also a brewing arms race. Russia has a nuclear modernization program going on. They're in violation of the INF Treaty. They've started building some of those missiles that were banned 87, so 30 years ago. Russia has suspended compliance with the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, which is the conventional arms control deal that restricts Russian military. Russia has renewed aggressive naval and air patrolling. I don't know how many of y'all noticed the brief thing last month when there was this Russian spy ship a couple hundred miles off the coast of Delaware. That kind of stuff is happening more than it used to. I didn't hear about the yesterday one. You can tell me in Q&A. And then there's the missile defense issue. What does the United States want to do about missile defense, given the fact that this also raises Russian hackles? And it's not entirely clear how useful it is. Then there's the potential Russian threat to Estonia and Latvia, the issue of Russian involvement in the US election, and what do we do about Russia's desire to regain great power status? And when they define status as basically meaning being able to tell us no, right? For them, status means they can tell the Americans, don't do this, and have it stick. And so they're deeply offended when the US goes ahead anyway. So what do you do about that if you're the United States? Well, here are the options. And I always explain this to my national security students. Most major national security decisions present the decision makers with three options: bad, worse, and really awful. And the hard part is figuring out which option will lead to which outcome. So recognizing that what we've got here is a bunch of options that would range from bad to awful. So basically you've got the liberal option and you've got the conservative option. Conservative option is, coercion, right? Russia's evil, you got to stand up to him, you got to be tough. What does that mean? Well, so one conservative policy paper I saw suggested, okay, so we've got to reinforce the NATO troops we have in the Baltic states now. Right now we have one battalion, scattered across all three Baltic states, so a few hundred American or Allied troops in each one. Obviously militarily negligible, right? So they suggested we should reinforce that to an entire battalion in each of those three countries, maybe 1,000 NATO troops in each, which is also militarily irrelevant. Absolutely militarily negligible, right? But it sends a message, just a slightly stronger message, right? A few hundred more troops worth of message. And that's, in fact, well, I don't think it was Ariel, but it was from a Heritage Foundation paper. The fact of the matter is that the Baltic states are militarily indefensible. If Russia wants to invade those places and take them over, it can. The reason it doesn't is because they don't know what happens next. And frankly, neither does anybody else. But it might get very ugly. Another option available to the US is to increase aid to Ukraine, right? If Ukraine is the victim of Russian military aggression, help them out, right? Provide economic aid. Ukraine is thoroughly corrupt, so provide some help in kind of cleaning up their corruption. Provide military aid to help them fight back. The problem is Russia has what military experts call escalation dominance, which basically means whatever the US puts in, the Russians can more than match it. You can't change the balance of power there. The Russians are more powerful, largely because they simply care more. The Russians will go to the mat for Ukraine. The Americans won't. So you give more aid to the Ukrainians, you get a bigger war, but not necessarily a better outcome. Other tough options. You can intensify economic sanctions. I'll let you guys decide whether you think that's going to make much difference or not. You can increase propaganda and cyber efforts. So one creative suggestion is you could publicize the fact that Putin is a multi-billionaire. And gee, how did he get that way on a KGB salary? All right. And you can also push, as President Trump is doing, for NATO allies to increase their defense spending. Good luck there. Right, so you got a lot of sort of more or less coercive options, but none of them are really that strong, and none of them are really likely to change very much. So, my liberal friends come forward. Okay, let's try negotiations and let's talk this out. Let's work out a deal. So what could we do? All right, well, one thing we could do is make clear that Ukraine and Georgia are not going to be part of NATO. They're right on the Russian border. They're former Soviet member states. The U.S. is never going to be able to defend them. There was some discussion that they might be able to join NATO in the future. Let's just all agree that that's not going to happen, right? It'll reassure the Russians while keeping the United States out of security commitments that it doesn't want to make anyway. All right, so why not do that? Why not reduce missile defense efforts in Europe? Part of the reason President Obama sort of flipped on that issue and decided not to go forward with some of those plans was because the technology doesn't work that well anyway. So why bother? Why not do a few things to kind of make the Russians a little happier and exchange that for an end to the war in Ukraine? The only problem with that is that probably won't work either. So that's in Europe. Middle East, it's nowhere near that optimistic. What do you do especially about the Syria problem? You could try to, you could build on President Trump's flight of missiles and try to muscle the Russians out of Syria by continuing airstrikes and missile strikes. You just kind of keep on doing it and kind of encourage the Russians to kind of get out of the way and keep on getting out of the way until they're out of Syria. All right, it might be possible to do that. On the other hand, that might lead to a direct military clash with Russia. If that happens, the Russians lose in Syria, but they're going to retaliate someplace else. Right? Where else are they going to retaliate? And I had a really creative idea on where that might be, but I forgot now. All right, so that's option number one. Option number two is, all right, push aside Russia and just deal with what the real problem in the Middle East is, which is ISIS. So, to quote our esteemed president, bomb the shit out of them, right? The problem is that airstrikes against a conventional military enemy like ISIS are ineffective unless you have allies on the ground. And among the Sunni opposition to President Assad in Syria, the most powerful alternative to ISIS is, again, al-Nusra, that is to say the al-Qaeda affiliate in the region, right? So we want to bomb ISIS in order to strengthen al-Qaeda, right? That's what that option basically looks like. You can give aid to the so-called moderate rebels, the ones that are theoretically on the American side, but the problem is that there's a very, very long track record. When the US or anybody gives military aid to some rebel group, some militia organization, the weapons keep on spreading, and they get into some pretty unsavory hands. So again, you give aid to America's moderate allies in the region, and some of it's going to end up in the hands of ISIS, and some of it's going to end up in the hands of al-Qaeda. So, again, my liberal friends come out. Okay, you see, coercion's not going to work. Let's cut a deal. Well, okay, what's the diplomatic strategy then? So one option is to ally with Assad and Russia against ISIS, right? That's what Putin is saying the US should do. The only problem is that President Assad represents the Alawite minority within Syria. The Sunni majority, backs various rebel factions. So the places where Assad controls are basically places where the Sunnis have been ethnically cleansed out. That's why half the population of Syria is a refugee now. So allying with Russia against and Assad against ISIS will not stabilize the region. So the other possibility is what Obama's diplomatic strategy was, to use diplomacy to try to get Assad out of power so it becomes possible to sort of put Syria back together again. The problem is that that's not acceptable to anybody else. Assad obviously doesn't want to go. His supporters don't want to see him go. The Russians don't want him to go. The Iranians don't want him to go. So that deal isn't happening either. So my conclusion. There are three ways of thinking about US-Russian relations. And all of them are totally inadequate. The first one is Sasha's view. Russia's just acting defensively. The conflict is the fault of the West. Second is the conservative American view. Russia is evil and it must be stopped. Period. And you do that by being tough. The liberal view is Russia can't be stopped. We cannot stop them from doing things like intervening in Syria and Ukraine. So we've got to cut a deal. The problem is that in each case, the premise is true and the conclusion is wrong, right? Is Russia acting defensively as they see it? Yeah. Does that mean the conflict is our fault? No. Is Russia evil? Yeah, they've done a lot of evil things. Does that mean it must be stopped? Well, practically, we can't stop it, all right? Russia cannot be stopped, right? So we must cut a deal, but we can't. There is no deal out there that's going to work. So my assessment of this is basically, that's what a Cold War looks like, all right? We can't fight a hot war, all right? Both sides have nuclear weapons. Both sides agree it wouldn't be worth it even if we didn't have nuclear weapons. It's not going to be a hot war between the US and Russia. But there is a fundamental disagreement in the way they think the world ought to be. And that conflict is not going away. It has something to do with different political systems. Putin's a dictator. Trump is only a wannabe dictator. We've got different political systems, different views. We're not going to work it out. So that's my answer. The bromance is dead. We're heading for a new Cold War. I'll give you a teaser. If anybody wants, I can go through, oops, as usual, the wrong way, the rogues gallery of Russia-Trump ties, but that's a slightly different topic, so I'll only do it if somebody asks. Other than that, thank you.